big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Leese.
Does anyone know what the Frontier Center for Public Policy is? Anyone? Not a single person? No, surely, come on. Gord Lee has been with us for years. We know that many of you are dear friends of Frontier, but we are known as a public policy think tank. So we're about better ideas. We're nonpartisan. We don't receive any government funding or payoffs, but we try to look earnestly at trying to promote good thinking for public policy thinking. And we think that is more important than ever. As we look at the state of our nation, we're very concerned about how we move forward our economy, our standard of living, and so many issues. And we do so with some trepidation at times, because sometimes it's not easy to talk about areas that perhaps people may not even want to talk about. So on the back, pardon my pointing here, there is a display of some of the work that we do. You'll notice that those are books that are for sale, and you would have received a book that is entitled So Much More We Can Be. And this is a beautiful example, I think, of the kind of reflective work that Frontier does as we think about how do we learn from these episodes. So we're delighted that Grant and Chantel Devine are here, along with many members of their family, including their son David and Tracy, and so many others. So we're really glad that you're here joining us today. So a warm welcome to them. What I also wanted to do is remember that towards the end of this week, we are days away from a very special day when all Canadians pause and reflect on the sacrifice that people made before us so that we can have the freedom that we enjoy. And these are freedoms that are so important to Frontier. Freedom of speech, the rule of law, evidence-based thinking, and a respect and tolerance for us in a community. And so this is very important. So I want to just simply acknowledge that Remembrance Day is coming before us, and we are very proud as Canadians to be able to remember that sacrifice. So on that note, I also wanted to just highlight a number of persons that are with us today, including a number of board members. Ivan Holloway is our secretary. Ivan. And I also, of course, want to highlight again John Heimbecker. And we also have a number of senior fellows here that work with us at Frontier, including Dr. Rodney Clifton. There's his hand. And I think Dr. Jerry Bowler is here as well, but I believe he's on his way. So on that note, I also wanted to acknowledge that we have some elected officials, and I apologize if I miss anyone, but that includes the Honorable Kelvin Gertson. Thank you, Calvin. And I believe Abi Khan is here as our MLA. And I believe Josh Gunter was here as well. So we're delighted that all of you are here, and a special shout out to a lot of students are working with Frontier, including representatives from the Conservative Association of the University of Manitoba and the University of Winnipeg. So please stand up, guys, and get a round of applause. So I want to move to the next part of our program. And what I'd like to do is begin by thanking another board member that I failed to introduce, Mr. Ken Muse. Ken, please stand up. Does anyone know Ken? It was remarkable. We always laughed about the Preston Manning event, how many people had been touched by Ken in terms of bringing that event together. And we're also delighted to thank Matthew Lane, as well as Sophia Leese, and also I believe Peter Hawley. And am I missing anyone else with that event? So we're really grateful that we could all work together, including Zeke Hawley in the back there. So have a wave, but round of applause to them. All right, so what I'd like to do is get some help from our president, Peter Hawley. And you may not know this, but there's some intriguing background regarding the great Peter Hawley. And that is that Peter, as a young man in the 1980s, actually got involved with the Grant Devine government. Can you believe it? And when we talk about the theme, So Much More We Can Be, the young man, Peter Hawley, was involved in a special policy unit. What is a policy unit? It was a special group that the Devine government put together, and this would be a really good question to ask the Honorable Grant Devine, why he did this. But the context is that we observe that in many governments, although they're well-intended, do not have a lot of policy capacity. In fact, one of our friends, Lord Conrad Black, would say many governments are elected and hold power but do not govern, do not lead. And so it was intriguing that the Devine government had the wisdom to set up this policy unit, which Peter Hawley was part of, that was instrumental in moving forward a myriad of initiatives, including areas of privatization. And that will be spoken about later. But the point is that this is one of the reasons why we have these events, and we welcome your feedback as the opportunity to learn incisively about policy. What were good ideas that worked? And per evidence, what are things that did not work? And what do we learn from those lessons so that we can move our country forward? So on that note, I would like to call forward Peter Hawley. Please join with me in welcoming him as he introduces the Honorable Grant Devine.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks, everybody. This is our second big blockbuster lunch, and it's great to see a lot of familiar faces here. I'm, of course, a Saskatchewan person. We're part of the Saskatchewan Mafia. We're all over the place. And, it is interesting, this project, the book that you have, there was a bit of a difficult birth around it, but it took us several years to put it together. And again, most of the history about Grant Devine and the Grant Devine government had been written by the University of Regina Political Science Department, so you would guess that it was probably a little off. This book was basically a deep dive into facts, and our conclusion, of course, was that at the end of the day, if you look at Saskatchewan today, the most conservative province, and again, if you're the leader of the NDP in Saskatchewan, it's just very bleak. There's just nothing to look forward to, and all the all the opposition in Saskatchewan is coming from the right, for example. So Saskatchewan is an interesting place. It was the birthplace of socialism in Canada. If you go back, there's something called the Regina Manifesto, which was a hard Marxist screed which talked about government ownership of the economy. And again, for you Saskatchewan history buffs, Tommy Douglas did do a series of experiments around government ownership. And there's actually a history of government shoe factories and government box factories. And they were the first experiment of, let's say, government ownership in Canada. Of course, they all failed. And I remember as a young lad watching Star Wars, it was 1977, and I would go to the theaters and there would be a big trailer at the beginning on our family of crown corporations. I don't know if, Grant, if you remember that. And at that time, we were told, of course, that all these things were for the good of Saskatchewan. And if you know the history, the potash mines were nationalized during the 1970s. So we We had places in Mexico and the third world nationalizing things, but then there was Saskatchewan doing the same thing. And so Saskatchewan was a place of big government, and let's just call it, it was a friendly, socialist kind of place. So Grant Devine was elected in 1982. And again, I was fortunate in that I ended up, at the time there were no jobs anywhere. I just graduated. I ended up in Saskatchewan. And I did end up in something called the Planning Bureau, and then it became the Policy Secretariat. And then it became the Department of Public Participation, or I moved to the Department of Public Participation, which was the place that was talking about privatization. And that was, one of Grant's big achievements was to essentially change the nature of government. And I could talk for a long time on this, but there were government companies that were in the mining business, and they were all privatized. And today, if you look, Potash Corporation became Nutrien, which is the biggest potash producer in the world. SMDC became Cameco, I think the second or first largest uranium company in the world. And I'd have to say that Saskatchewan today is, if you go, it is a booming place, very diversified agriculture economy, lots on the go. And I have to say this with, I have to be a little delicate here. When we moved to Winnipeg in 1991, I married my dear wife, who's not here, but she was transferred to Winnipeg, and I ended up here. Saskatchewan was the poor kid on the block, and things have flipped around. So today, I would have to say that Manitoba is the poor kid on the block. And I looked up some stats today, and the average per capita income in Saskatchewan is $61,000. In Manitoba, it is $47,000. That's a difference of 30%. So Saskatchewan went from being much poorer than Manitoba to being today much substantially richer than Manitoba. Now in the book, we do a deep dive into what happened, and again, there are quite in-depth numbers in here on how the economy diversified in Saskatchewan. Big mega projects that were brought in by the Grant Devine government. But again, what was important was that the government didn't own things. It was a facilitator of things, okay? And I'm sure Grant will talk about that at length here. And by the way, I think Grant has agreed to sign books afterwards if you are interested. So let me get into the bio. Grant was elected the 11th Premier of Saskatchewan, serving 2 terms from 1982 to 1991. And one thing that I like to say is that Grant's government had some very tough times. He had 2 terms, and it was the only government that had 3 recessions in those 2 terms. So if you remember Saskatchewan, price of oil was down, there were droughts. It was not easy sledding. However, there were some very big things that happened, and again, those are in the book here. Grant is a U of S agriculture graduate, degrees from University of Alberta and Ohio State. He has a PhD from Ohio State. He began teaching at the U of S in the 70s before entering politics, and he currently has a farm and ranch near Moose Jaw. He lives in Saskatoon with Chantal, his wife. And in 2009, he was honored with the Saskatchewan Order of Merit for his contributions to the province. And Grant, of course, serves on several committees of the Board of Governors at the University of Saskatchewan. Please welcome Dr. Grant Devine.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. It is our pleasure to be here in Winnipeg. Thanks to the Foundation for all the work and time it took to put the book together. Work of labor. For those of you who don't know, I was in power with Premier Howard Pauley and Gary Filmon. And it was interesting that I had a good friend at fundraiser, Izzy Asper, and he was the Liberal leader and became a friend of mine. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about today is if you want to win, you need to make friends. Not a bad idea, right? And often if you listen, you might learn, and then you might lead. So I've got some examples about that. What I want to talk today about is not so much about what we did, but why we did it and how. So I'm going to acknowledge my old pal Charlie Mayer sitting over there. We did an awful lot together with his government. Some fantastic things like the Free Trade Agreement, and one that I will talk about, one of the largest treaty settlements with Indigenous people in Canada. And Charlie was very much involved with that, with Bill McKnight and the Prime Minister, and an old friend of mine, Chief Roland Crow. And I'll talk about that. I got to say that it's great to have David here, my son, and we went to the big hockey game last night, and holy smokes, I mean, it was like playoff hockey. It was really, really good. And his wife Tracy, and we're so happy to be here because of our three granddaughters and their grandma and grandpa, the Dumas. Thanks, I see here. And Denny, I see you showed up late, but it's all right. Great hockey player. And I have to say, Chantal and I were really impressed with downtown Winnipeg. I mean, whatever the municipal government and provincial government and others are doing, it's really fascinating to go downtown Winnipeg. And that True North Centre that David took us to and the whole Canada Life thing was marvelous. So I congratulate the city. You're doing well. And this city's been known for the grain business and the insurance business, and your hockey team and your football team and a whole bunch of other stuff is really on a roll. But I'm going to give you a couple more ideas that you might consider, because I think you've got a fantastic future. A fantastic future. And I'm not just teasing you. I think it's here. So I'm going to just talk about, I think, 4 things. I'll give you a little bit of history of where I come from, so you get to know, again, sort of why we did what we did, and then how. Peter briefly talked about the conditions we faced, and it's pretty scary, but we're going through some scary stuff right now. Number 3, the action, and today what I think are some of the opportunities. So I'm going to give you a little bit of my personal background. My grandparents were immigrants, like a lot of your grandparents and parents. They came up in about 1900 from the United States, and they were hardworking people. I mean, you walked up and you had horses, maybe you had a wagon, you had a plow, and they had to take on quarter section, and that's the way it was. But they were very determined, very determined, but very compassionate. I would say competitive and compassionate. They would help the neighbor all the time to get through because it was tough times. But if you met them in the hockey rink and they were from another town, they'd board you right the heck out of there, right? I mean, they were competitive, but they're compassionate. So my grandfather Devine was a big fan of Tommy Douglas, because Tommy Douglas in that time, particular time, he thought helped save the farm. So I listened to the progressive side of politics. My grandpa Ford was a right-wing Democrat that came up from the U.S., and he ran an elevator near Gray, Saskatchewan, and he was a right-winger. The CCF guy voted for Diefenbaker federally. He says there's no point in having these guys run the country. He says, but you know, locally that'd be all right. So I heard it all growing up, and I loved them both dearly. We happened to live in the same yard as my grandparents. When after the war, I was born in '44, and we moved out to the farm, and I lived with Grandma and Grandpa Devine and Mom and Dad and so forth. But their views were interesting because both these dear men and their wives were compassionate but competitive. So you drew from both. And I'm reminded of the first time I met with Peter Lougheed when I was elected. We were in the office in Edmonton. And he said, you got to stay balanced. You got to stay balanced. He said, if you want to spend money on health and education and highways and so forth, that's fine. They're pretty much natural public goods. But see all those businesses out there? You ought to keep them relatively happy so they're paying some taxes so you can afford to do that. And in his particular time, he built lots of things and had a huge heritage fund. He was balanced. He was balanced. So that sort of carried my background into politics. I was kind of and Charlie might know this, half-assed to leave the university because I had got a PhD in economics and MBA in marketing. I came back to Saskatchewan, and Saskatchewan was not that active. I mean, I remember a dear friend from Raymore, Gordon McMurtry, was the Minister of Agriculture, and he said, I'll tell you what I want you to do. I want you to summer follow a lot and grow wheat. That was it. And you can sell your land to the government because we have land bank, and you can farm for us. And he says, the Crown corporations will control the resources and we'll try to keep most of it in the ground for the next century or so. True story. So for a guy like me coming back, because I was gone to school in various places, an economist, I'm thinking about multipliers and economic activity and all the things you can do. We were hauling logs to New York City. I said, well, what if we haul paper? What are the multiplier effects of paper on a truck versus a log, right? So that's when, anyway, I was asked to leave the university by some of the left-wing organizations and some of them were elevator companies, as a matter of fact. But because I was talking multipliers and economic development and some of these things that just didn't fit the way the government of the day looked. So came home from university one day and I said to Chantel, we've got three choices, right? Either I quit talking about what I was taught from three different universities in economics and business and marketing and trade. And she said, well, they'll never shut you up because you like to talk, right? So, well, then I said, we got to move. We got to go someplace else because, you know, it's not comfortable here. Well, she says, we're not moving. We have hauled kids and trailers and whatever from Ottawa to Regina to Saskatoon to Columbus, Ohio, and back again and back to Ottawa. I said, that's it, we're not moving. So I said, well, I guess we'll just have to take them on. A novice. Had some economic views, didn't really have political views, but I knew I wasn't what was going on in the Saskatchewan. I just knew there was, and that brings me to the title of the book. So I ran for a nomination and I won, and I ran in the election in '78, and guess what? I got smoked. We knocked every door in a riding called Nutana in Saskatoon. We thought we were winning, but we were fools. And, you know, and again, Wes Robbins, a tough old cabinet minister. After that, some people in the party came up and said, well, would you run for leader? And the leader at that time was Culver. And I said, I didn't win. But they said, you have a great message. You've got a great message of more. So I ran for leader and I won. Then I didn't have a seat. I wasn't in the legislature. So my good friend Roy Romano just called me the invisible man because I wasn't in there, right? But what I did was, as I say, I went out and listened and made friends. I listened to farmers and ranchers and oil people and moms and dads and grandparents, asking them questions. What's going on? And what came back was, there is so much more we can be. We have the resources, we have the education, we have the universities. We have businesses that if you let them go, we think we can really make it work. And so when I went back and started giving presentations, I just gave them what they gave me. I said, we can do this. There's so much more we can be. You can do this in oil and energy and potash and uranium and coal and forestry. And they thought I was smart, but all I was doing is giving what they told me Saskatchewan could be. So that's where, when we did really make some changes, and we privatized and we built upgraders. We built the first fertilizer plant. We got almost half the farmland in Canada in Saskatchewan. We were bringing in nitrogen fertilizer from someplace else, and we have no end to natural gas. Just stuff like that. Rafferty, Alameda. We had, if you look in the book, there's a line between Alberta and Saskatchewan. All the oil wells are black here, and there was nothing going on over there. So we said, if you come to Saskatchewan in the Bakken Play, which is on the west side of Manitoba and into Saskatchewan and North Dakota, Montana, if you come here, we'll give you 3 years royalty holiday. Now, if you drill and you don't find anything, fine. But if you find something, you don't pay royalties for 3 years. But then we'll pick them up for the next 35. Well, if you drive south of Weyburn or around Estevan, or you talk a number 6 south of Regina and you look west, there is nothing but pump jacks going. I hunt pheasant down there. What it said is that if you allow, as Peter Lougheed said, the balance of people to create wealth, you will have more to distribute if you think that that should be the role of government. Now, from my experience, and I guess I would admit I'm biased. I'm a progressive conservative, and I mean that like Charlie. I'm progressive and conservative. There's things that belong to the public sector, and I understand that. But it's much easier to referee the private sector than it is the public sector. All you got to do is look at Europe, or look at some of the mistakes in Canada and the United States. Government is tougher to manage, because if you get offside, you're stuck there for a while, right? So, and I find it interesting that the private sector creates, as they do in Winnipeg here, create more and more wealth. And then people say, well, they're too successful. I got to go claw it back. My thought is, put more people there. That's the winning side. That's the winning side. Healthcare, almost 50% of our budgets are healthcare. That's the sucking side that takes all the money. So if you want to make more money, put more kids, more economic incentives to have people go into business and build and trade and work, and they create wealth. Again, it's a balance. I'm not being radical. And one of the questions over here, what I thought about the U.S. election. What happens from time to time, I'll answer it, is you get too far apart. There's a whole bunch of common sense that says we can be balanced. We have a good role for the public sector and a very significant role for the private sector. So I'm just going to shift gears. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is that what are some of the consequences of what's going on today? I think people have made, and I mean, I'm on the board of Ducks Unlimited. I'm all for the environment, and I love ducks, okay? Wildlife, water projects, and so forth. So I feel comfortable in talking about any problems in the climate. I want to try to fix them. I have one view. You can tax all you like, but it doesn't change the weather. Okay? So what some of my research and some of the companies I'm working at, and even need the university, is that if you think there's too much carbon, CO2, capture it. Capture it. My son John works for Pembina Pipeline in Calgary. And you know what? they're building a carbon pipeline. They go to the industries in Edmonton, capture carbon, put it in a pipeline, sequester it. And now they're finding out there's a market for carbon. Calgary company is making soap from carbon, and there's lots of other things. There's carbon in this whole room. In the agriculture sector, with best practices, we're finding we're a net carbon sink in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, which means you put up about 2 tons while you're farming, but you sequester or sink 5 with best practices. And they're taxing us because we're doing that. We're best practices. We're the best dryland farmers in the world. So give us credit, and that's some of the companies that we're working on, to help us get that message across, that you can capture it. We have the technology, and you can make things with it, as opposed to, like, for the triple tax on farmers is, I mean, I just don't get it, because we still have to drive the trucks and the combines and all the rest of the stuff, and I'm all for looking for alternatives. If you have enough wind, if you have enough sun, or if you have enough whatever, fine, but we're not there yet. We all need to drive and live and warm our homes and do all these things until we figure out, what are we going to do? So if you're anti-fossil fuel today, you might say, well, you're not in favor of climate change. Fine, I'm in favor of climate fixing. Show me how. But I got to still drive my truck and my combine and my kids to school and sports and do this and fly and, on and on. So I'm going to end with this. But I'm not leaving. Chantal and I were just in Ireland. So Ireland has no energy. None. Domestic. They used to have some coal, but they don't have anything now. So I'm visiting with this fellow on, there's a little island off the cliffs of Moher on the southwest corner of Ireland. And we get talking and so forth, and he says, we don't have any energy here in Ireland. They don't say Ireland, they say Ireland. And they can't say TH, they say 1, 2, 3. I mean, I'm Irish, right, by ancestry. But he said, I can almost see Hudson Bay from where I am. And you have energy, you have natural gas, you have LNG, you have all the things we need, and you have food, and you have food fertilizer. And it seems to me that in the prairies there's one deep water port in one of those provinces, Manitoba. Deep water port. So again, I think about the possibilities of if Europe has made all these mistakes in trying to fix climate change, and they're going to be desperate, and they're going to perhaps to some degree freeze in the dark, and we can help them, we can be really, really busy going into the next century, because they're not going to fix this quickly, and I'm sure Mr. Putin isn't going to be nice to get it done. But they've made some terrible strategic mistakes, because they said no more oil, no more gas, no uranium, no more coal. Well, what are you going to do? Well, I got Russia. Well, good luck. So there's us. So when you think about why you do things and how you do things, I think all political parties could endorse a project, and I just suggest this. I mean, to really seriously look at using Hudson Bay, Port Nelson, or whatever works to build a pipeline for natural gas, put a LNG, liquid gas program right there, facilitate export of liquid natural gas to Europe. Do the same for oil. And I've done a fair amount of literature research of Elon Musk's tube travel. You could do the same thing with the tube travel. We built a system that, and I did it with fourth-year students at the university. You go from Moose Jaw to Langley. It's in a tube. It's run in a vacuum. It levitates on magnets, and you run it with natural gas. You can put 10 ton of grain in a container, and it goes hundreds of miles an hour, impervious to weather, environmentally really friendly. And you know, when you think about these visions, hundreds of years ago, somebody said, with men and horses, I'm willing to build a railroad across Canada, through the mountains. God bless them. And we can't lay a pipeline to our own deep water port? Hello, Canada. Hello, prairies. Hello, you know, with great respect, Winnipeg and Manitoba. I mean, we're linked at the hip. We need access to ports. We have to cross mountains going west. You got BC politics, you got Quebec politics going east. You can't build pipelines. You bring our oil in for Eastern Canada from Venezuela, and we got too much of it. It's not political. It's just sit down with people and deal with common sense. Okay, the last thing I'd say is, again, I get carried away and I get talking here, but to be successful, you have to make friends. So, one of the things that Bill McKnight and Charlie said, and I had talked to the Prime Minister Mulroney at the time, is that we need to settle some treaties. So one of my advisors, I forget who it might be, maybe it was Peter, maybe somebody else, said, well, there's a chief of the Saskatchewan Federation of Indians, nations at that time, Roland Crow. Would you meet with him? So Roland Crow and I got on horseback, because I grew up on horseback, and he did, and we rode into the Qu'Appelle Valley for several hours. Got to know each other. Got to know each other. And what we came to with an agreement was willing seller and a willing buyer. Could you find people who would sell farmland, ranch land, potash land, oil land, urban land, others, to a willing buyer? And we came to the conclusion, with the help of the Prime Minister and the help of the rural municipalities in Saskatchewan, which was a tough sell, and all of the Indigenous people, because Roland was good, we ended up moving 1 million acres into the hands of Indigenous communities in Treaty 6. It's generated well over $1 billion in economic activity, including urban businesses and casinos and others, with potash revenues, oil revenues, and others. The number of Indigenous people going to the University of Saskatchewan and University of Regina continues to go up. So, Roland Crow is my friend. And if you want to build ports, Dorothy, or if you want to do other things in economic activity, social activity, have a friend that's an Indigenous person. Walk in their shoes, listen. If you listen, you will learn, and then you can lead. And then they'll follow your vision. Maybe. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, the Honourable Grant Devine, a very inspiring overview, and the discussion has just begun. What we'd like to do is turn to you as the audience to be able to invite your written questions. So with our help from our dynamic friend Matt Lane, if you have a question that you'd like to pose to Grant Devine, we'd welcome you to fill out that and bring it forward. I do have 2 questions. One question would be, the first one is, if you had to do it all over again, how would you do things differently?
Well, obviously, in the front part of the book, we made mistakes. I had people that were not nice, and people that end up in jail, and people that made some mistakes. I think one of my imperfections is being somebody that's looking down the road to build, you can overlook detail. And you need to have people, you know, at your side are saying, keep an eye on this and this. And I think well-managed companies and well-managed organizations have some help to do detail. Now, if a leader gets all wrapped up in detail, you'll probably lose the vision. So it's a balance, and I think I probably could have done a better job of that balance. In terms of building things, when we first got elected, we said, we'll probably only get 4 years, so we'll just go to beat the band and do it. And then we got another 4 years, and we just kept building and building and building. And took on some, like Rafferty Alameda projects, a big water project on the Souris River, and giving Minot, North Dakota, 100-year flood protection. I mean, it went to court. We fought it federally. We did all the things that we could do. But those old pioneers that said, that'll work, to actually show them that Rafferty Alameda dams filled up the best, some of walleye fishing in North America, and they were right. Again, there's so much more we can be with this dry old valley that's just a huge dish. If you could just stop the water now and then, you'd have this great resource for ducks and geese and fishermen and farmers and irrigation. So yeah, that's a tough question. I mean, people make mistakes. You can't dwell on them too much. You got to move on. We all make mistakes. As they say, we're all sinners. It reminds me, one of the things that motivated me was the John Diefenbaker Bill of Rights. This country is founded upon the principles that acknowledges the supremacy of God, the dignity of man, and the role of the family in a nation of free men and free women. Now, if you kind of stick with that, you don't get too goofy, right? Because you love your neighbors and your family, and you can forgive yourself, and you can also forgive the competitiveness. And anybody that's played competitive sports, as politics is competitive, you can really play competitively, but it doesn't mean you don't like the guy or the girl or whatever. I think that's a major lesson in life. But
If you had to do it again, would you hire Peter Hawley? No, I'm just kidding. But just speaking of the policy unit that Peter referred to, why did you set up that policy unit within your government looking back?
Well, I think in part, again, to be successful, you have to look at all the dimensions and all the things that are necessary to make a policy change. So I remember going into real good old CCF homes and Tommy Douglas's picture was there, right? And I said, well, you could leave Tommy's there, but you could put mine in the living room, right? I mean, but what we did, interest rates for 20%. And CCF farmers and NDP farmers, particularly CCF, they were pretty tight farmers. And they said, I can't make it on 20%. I can't make it. Businesses were saying. So we just made the decision, as we did in the oil thing, is that we'd step between farm credit and banks and people, my friends, my constituents. So we said for farmers, the highest we will be is 8.5% on your FCC loans, and we'll pick up the difference. And for homeowners, 13.25%, which sounds really high now, and we'll make up the difference. That, in good part, from listening to people that were losing their farms, losing their homes, really helped us get elected because we were compassionate. We were compassionate. These are my family, my friends, my neighbors, my competitors, whatever. So, again, make friends. So, I think the combination of those things like that, the privatization, the value of the market itself and funding the public sector, as Peter looks at all the things in his recommendations here, I think you had 30 of them for things that you can do and so forth. I mean, it's interesting to have a really good, solid look at those things. And you have to have somebody to do it and have an institution to do it. So,
all right, we've got a number of other questions. Last week, Saskatchewan tabled the Saskatchewan First Act, which is similar to the so-called Alberta Sovereignty Act. What is your take on this?
Well, my take today is I think that Western Canada needs to act more like Quebec. That is, I'm going to do what I think is the right thing to do. The federal government probably will get in the way from time to time, but I can't just spend all my time complaining about the Prime Minister. So if we're going to build ports, or if we're going to do this, or we're going to capture carbon, or we're going to, just get on with it. I was in government when the first Trudeau was there. He didn't agree with all the things that we were doing, but we did it. I mean, it's not to be anti-Canadian, it's just that we have resources and we have talent and we have things that we can do. And, you know, if they won't let us build a pipeline across Eastern Canada to provide the world, let alone Eastern Canada, well, we'll build one someplace else. And we can do that. Oh, they may not like it. They'll complain environmentally. I mean, we did a water project, and it was like the worst thing that we could ever do was dam up some water. Well, it proved to be the best thing, and they, you know, we were in court and the rest of it. But so I think whatever Quebec can do legally and legislatively, manage their own this, manage their own that, manage this, that, so forth. We need to look at that very carefully and go that hard and that far. Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Alberta people feel there is so much more potential here. And be damned if we're going to just, you know, not do everything possible, still be great Canadians, but say we'll be a better Canadian if we can create wealth and prosperity and things and grow our economy. So, yeah, you got to just take them on a bit, not in a dumb way, but just take them on and build. Almost ignore them where you can. Like if we decided to build a pipeline through to Port Nelson, I'm sure the environmentalists and others would be just, but you can win. You can get allies from the indigenous community, rural communities, other places, and various companies that would like to export. And so, yeah, you know, you got to take them on. Don't say hole in a mud hole. That's my grandfather saying.
You've had a lot of experience working with the media. Often it seems that the media is very left-leaning, shall we say. How do you deal with that challenge?
That's a very good question. I mean, we don't really have a Fox News comparison here to take on CBC and CTV. And, you know, the federal government gives both those companies huge amounts of money. So, you know, if I worked for CBC, I'd kind of want to pretend I, you know, really like the Prime Minister. You know, for $1 billion, and you know, I think they have 12 different VPs. They all make a bunch of money and so forth. But you have to be careful. You've got to make friends, as opposed to, I would say, with respect, some presidential candidates in the U.S. just continue to make enemies. Well, they get the last word. So I think the consequence of what we heard or saw yesterday, as part of that is true, because if you're not making friends, you're making enemies. So even if you're really smart and you've been really successful, you know, humility is not a bad thing, even for a really smart person, right? And if you're married long enough, you learn that pretty quickly too. So no, I think the media has been biased. I don't think there's any question about it. We have some talk show hosts like John Gormley in Saskatoon who, you know, can really sort of bring the other side there. You got to be careful that you don't just nurture the extremes. You got to listen, make friends in the media. I mean, not in a crazy way, but just why are you, you know, hello, what are you doing here? Why, you know, do you really think taxes will change the weather? Show me the evidence. What's wrong with carbon capture? Can you talk to me about that? I mean, you got to be intimate with people. That's the best.
All right, we have 2 more questions. When you look at the state of Canada today, pardon me. When you look at the state of Canada today, are you concerned about the future of our country, or how do you look at the future in front of us?
Well, there's a good question. There's always been challenges, so this may not be particularly new. I mean, Justin Trudeau may be a nice young man, and he's perfectly bilingual, and he's handsome, but I disagree with an awful lot of his policies, and I'm not sure he, with respect, understands the magnitude of the job he has. And so, I mean, he has his views, but again, on climate change and some of the things on pipelines and taxes, I just can't agree with him. And I didn't agree with Pierre Trudeau on a lot of that stuff. And he eventually went across the prairies and put his finger up and, you know, and whatever. But I got to, here's a couple of stories while you're here. So the Prime Minister Trudeau, he came to Saskatoon to meet with us, and he wasn't very popular, and I was pretty popular. So we're upstairs in the Besborough Hotel, and I'm not getting very far with him. I changed the topic. Asked him about his children. Asked him about his children. And his demeanor just shifted. And he went on and on about his children. And I told him some of mine. So it was time for us to go down and have a news conference, and he said, I'll tell you what, I'm not that popular here. I'll go down first, he said, and I'll take on the media because they'll come running at me. And then I'll leave. And you don't have to come down and stand beside me because I'm pretty unpopular. So that's what he did. He went down, he handled it, then I went down and I was more positive. I could still talk badly about him, well, not real badly, but because we had kind of become friends, friendly fathers, right? But that was, you know, again, how do you get to people is important. So here's the last one. The first time I was going to 24 Sussex, somebody like Peter said, now, when you go to 24 Sussex, all the premiers and the Prime Minister are going to be there in a room. And René Lévesque and Trudeau will just get at it in French. Most of you won't know what's going on, and they'll just be quiet. Just sit there. Be quiet. So, sure enough, that's exactly what happened. After about 7 or 8 minutes of that, I'm sitting a couple chairs down. I get up from my seat, and I go into the foyer where the media is, and there's a piano there. And I used to play boogie-woogies and swing on the piano, stuff like this, right? Played a lot of piano. So I'm sitting there, a little bit of swing music, little shanty in old shanty town, or something like this. Out walks the premier. Well, out walks another premier. Pretty soon, they all came out around the piano. So there's a picture of me, and the kids know it, Chantel. I'm playing the piano. Behind me is René Lévesque, and behind him is Trudeau. They're both laughing. Behind him is Richard Hatfield, and behind him is Peter Lougheed, all with a grin on their face. So I sent the picture to the Prime Minister and said, would you sign the picture? And he did. He says, Dear Grant, thanks for playing at my party. Hope we can do it again soon. Pierre. Then I thought, I wonder if I could send it to Lévesque. I sent it to Lévesque. And it came back kind of half over Trudeau's signature, ditto. And I seldom agree with the son of a bitch, Rennie. We have that picture in most of our homes, right? But again, it kind of made friends with, you know, something could touch them, and then they diminished. And we went back and did business, and carried on, and they quit fighting, and then, anyway. That's
I'd like to call forward our board member and board secretary, Ivan Holloway, to say thank you to the Honorable Grant Devine, and thank him as well for that Irish storytelling.
Well, thank you for that, Mr. Devine. It was good for you to come out and talk to us today. I perhaps don't have as many pearls of wisdom as you do, but I'm going to try for a moment, and bear with me if you may. The first is, I'm going to comment that problem with capitalism is that it creates inequality. The problem with socialism is that it makes everyone equally impoverished. We should ask ourselves, which problem would you prefer to have? Now, Mr. Devine came into power after 35 years or so of socialist government. And I'm going to level with you for a second. I don't know if I made up that quote or if I stole it from someone else, and I honestly don't know.
Winston Churchill.
Was it Winston Churchill? Okay, well, my apologies to Winston Churchill for that. I was going to say that if I'd made it up myself, that if anyone else copied it, I'd want attribution and royalties. In 1982, the problem inherited by Grant Devine was a legacy of over 35 years of socialist economic policies. The result was a province destined for mediocrity and economic stagnation. The province needed a fresh approach. It needed some good ideas and someone who is capable of executing them. Too often those who have good ideas are not leaders. And too often those who are leaders don't have good ideas. Grant Devine is a rare exception to that rule. He was both a courageous leader and a person who had taken the time to formulate thoughtful, bold, and fresh ideas. There's some ideas worked better than others. Luck was not always on Grant Devine's side, but there is no doubt that he significantly improved the economic trajectory of the province of Saskatchewan. We, in this province, would be remiss if we ignored Devine's legacy and if we failed to consider whether some of his ideas could be applied here as well. You, sir, have made a profound difference to the lives of the people of Saskatchewan. Thank you for your contribution to Saskatchewan and, by extension, your contribution to Canada. Thank you for coming to the home of the blue and gold and for speaking to us today.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and thank you to you for coming out today. I hope you've enjoyed the opportunity to not only learn more about the legacy of the Devine government and those policies, but also to get a glimpse in the wonderful personality of the Honourable Grant Devine. We're glad that we could come together. We invite you to get involved in Frontier. There's lots that is going on.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.